Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute clinical precision.
Oh, yeah. Like structural engineering or something.
Right. I mean, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is.
Yeah, the binary nature of a physical fracture is, it actually offers a strange kind of comfort.
It really does.
We prefer our reality to be visible, highly categorized, and just undeniable. Broken or not broken.
It is a clean line, but then you step into the theological landscape of final divine judgment, and suddenly that clinical x-ray machine just shatters.
It completely shatters.
Yeah, we are looking at a diagnostic reality today that is, quite honestly, terrifying in its scope. So today we are bringing you along on a deep dive into two distinct theological expositions of Matthew 25.34 through 40.
And that is the really famous passage detailing the separation of the sheep and the goats, right?
Uh-oh. Yes, that is the one. And our mission today is to investigate these specific documents alongside you because they aggressively challenge a very common cultural assumption.
They push back hard.
They really do. Because for centuries, people have used this specific text to argue that getting into heaven is simply a matter of general humanitarianism.
Like running community soup kitchens,
Mhm.
donating to various charities, or just achieving basic moral reform in your local neighborhood.
Right, just being a good person.
Right.
But the sources we are looking at today argue the complete opposite of that popular sentiment. So, okay, let's unpack this.
What is fascinating here is the core thesis operating behind these documents. They present this text not as some sentimental celebration of general philanthropy,
Yeah.
but as a majestic, really terrifying disclosure of final judgment. According to these expositions, this passage completely refutes the concept of works righteousness.
It just takes it off the table.
Totally. Instead, it puts the absolute sovereignty of the king on full display. The argument advanced is that the kingdom is reserved exclusively for those blessed by the Father from before the foundation of the world.
So the works come later.
Right. Any works these individuals do are the inevitable, visible fruit of an invisible supernatural regeneration.
Okay, before we look at the specific Greek grammar of the judgment itself, because I know we are going there, we have to understand the physical and psychological scene.
The setting is crucial.
Right, because we need to know when and where this conversation is taking place. Location and timing completely alter the tone of any decree.
They absolutely do. So the historical context provided by the sources centers on the Olivet Discourse.
Okay.
Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives.
Mhm.
And we are talking about a time frame, just days before his crucifixion.
Just days. Wow.
Yeah, he is looking down across the Kidron Valley at the massive temple complex in Jerusalem. And these are the very buildings he just prophesied would be utterly dismantled.
Right. He predicted that not one single stone would be left upon another. The disciples must have been reeling from the psychological shock of that.
Oh, without a doubt.
They point out these massive, beautiful limestone blocks, and some of these weighed hundreds of tons,
Yeah.
and he casually tells them the entire religious center of their universe is coming down.
And the religious and political tension in the city is at an absolute boiling point right now.
Because of the triumphal entry.
Yes. Jesus had just entered the city as the son of David. He cleansed the temple courtyard of the money changers, and he publicly confounded the hostile religious leaders.
So he is a massive target.
A huge target. Those same leaders are now actively plotting his assassination. He has been definitively rejected by the nation's elite.
Right.
And against that very dark backdrop, he speaks privately to his inner circle of disciples. The sources we are analyzing note that this text operates within a highly specific eschatological timeline.
Oh, yeah, here we go.
Yeah, the authors are writing from a reformed, dispensational, premillennial, and pre-tribulational framework.
Okay, wait, hold on. We just hit a massive wall of theological terminology there.
I know, it is a lot of syllables.
It is. So let's assume someone listening is completely lost, or maybe they are just dusting off some very old seminary terms they haven't thought about in a decade. Let's break those categories down.
Sure, let's take them piece by piece. In this specific framework, the authors make a vital structural distinction between the nation of Israel and the New Testament church.
Okay.
They argue this passage does not describe the great white throne judgment found in Revelation 20.
Which is what oh, wait, I shouldn't say exactly. Which is what specifically?
The great white throne is viewed specifically as the final judgment of the wicked dead at the very end of human history.
Got it.
They also state this text does not describe the Bema Seat judgment. The Bema Seat is understood as a separate evaluation specifically for the church to receive rewards.
So why wouldn't the church be judged here with the sheep and the goats? I mean, why are they absent?
Because in their pre-tribulational framework, the church, the bride of Christ, has already been raptured prior to this moment.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the church is physically absent from the tribulation events occurring on earth.
So if I am tracking this timeline right, the church is already gone. What does that mean for the world left behind, and where does this specific judgment fit in? I mean, what does it mean that this is a premillennial event?
The sources place this specific judgment, often called the judgment of the nations or the judgment of the Gentiles, at the absolute close of the Great Tribulation.
So right at the end of that 7-year period.
Yes, the prefix pre in premillennial means this event happens immediately prior to the establishment of the earthly millennial kingdom, which is a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth.
Okay, so the world has just gone through 7 years of apocalyptic terror.
Right. The Antichrist has waged a global coordinated war against the Jewish remnant and the tribulation saints.
And these tribulation saints, they are people who came to faith after the church was removed, right?
Yes, that is the view. True followers of Yahweh have been relentlessly hunted, starved, and imprisoned during this time.
It's a brutal scene.
Extremely. And then the Son of Man arrives in visible glory, touching down on the earth to judge the surviving nations.
Okay, think of it like a massive corporate restructuring. Let's try an analogy for you listening right now.
Oh, I like this.
So the old management, which has been incredibly corrupt and destructive, is being forcibly thrown out. But this moment right here, this judgment, it is not the final liquidation of the company at the very end of time.
Right, which would be the Great White Throne.
Precisely. This is the pivotal, intense audit right before the new CEO officially takes over the earthly headquarters to run it perfectly for a designated period.
And that designated period represents the millennial kingdom.
Yeah, does that track?
That is a highly effective way to visualize the timeline the authors are presenting. The audit is separating who was loyal to the true CEO during the hostile takeover attempt and who was actively aiding the enemy. And the authors point out the literary flow that gets us to this precise audit. Matthew 24 and 25 operate as a cohesive prophetic discourse.
They flow right into each other.
Yes. In chapter 24, Jesus details the terrifying signs of the end of the age and the absolute necessity of enduring to the end. Then, he transitions into a series of parables to illustrate preparedness.
The parables of readiness, right? Like the bridesmaids.
Yes, the parable of the 10 virgins. That one distinguishes between outward religious association and inward authentic preparedness. Half of the virgins have oil in their lamps, representing the Holy Spirit, and half do not.
And then the talents.
Right, the parable of the talents, distinguishing faithful servants who actively invest their master's deposits from the worthless servant who just, buries his talent in the dirt out of fear.
But those are all operating on the level of imagery, right? I mean, they're symbolic stories designed to teach a broader principle.
True. But then we hit our primary text, Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. The sources argue this is the grand, terrifying climax of the entire discourse.
The tone shifts completely.
It really does. The Lord shifts entirely away from parabolic imagery to literal, stark, spatial reality. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory.
So he is no longer telling a story about 10 bridesmaids.
No, he is speaking of a definitive, future temporal event. A formal, royal decree issued directly from the throne of universal dominion.
Now that the scene is set, we really need to look at the very first words the king speaks, because the sequence of his words is crucial.
It changes everything about how you interpret the passage.
Right. The sources argue this sequence completely shatters the idea of earning salvation through good deeds. Verse 34 says, "Then the king will say to those on his right hand, 'Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world.'"
The authors dive heavily into the linguistic analysis of the Greek text here. They use this grammar to prove their point against any form of works righteousness.
And what specific part of the grammar are they looking at?
They point out the phrase, blessed of my Father. In the Greek syntax, the word used for bless, which is eulogemenoi, operates as a perfect passive participle.
Okay, my eyes are completely glazing over at the term perfect passive participle.
I know, it sounds like an advanced linguistics class.
It does. I barely survived high school English grammar. So if I am the guy standing there in front of the king of the universe, what does the specific tense of that word actually mean for me and my eternal destiny?
It means everything. In Greek, the perfect tense indicates a completed action in the past that has continuing, permanent results in the present.
Okay. Completed in the past, permanent today.
Yes. And it is passive, meaning the action was done to the subject, not by the subject.
Oh, that is a huge distinction.
It really is. The sources call this a divine passive. The blessing was definitively completed by God the Father in the distant past, long before these people ever lifted a single finger to do a good deed or offer a cup of water.
So their election and their blessed state completely preceded any of their earthly actions. I mean, he says they inherit the kingdom. And when you think about how human families work, an inheritance is based entirely on birthright and sonship.
Exactly. Wait, I mean, that is spot on. You do not earn an inheritance by charging your parents an hourly wage for taking out the trash.
Right. It is freely given based on who your father is.
Furthermore, the text explicitly states the kingdom was prepared for you from the foundation of the world.
Before anything was even created.
Yeah. The authors explicitly connect this phrasing to the Reformed doctrine of the eternal decree of God. They reference the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 3.
What does that chapter outline?
It asserts that God ordained whatsoever comes to pass from all eternity. The preparation of the kingdom and the blessing of these specific people were settled before the universe even existed.
But right after he says they inherit the kingdom prepared from the foundation of the world, we hit this critical hinge word in verse 35. Jesus says, "For I was hungry and you gave me food."
Yes. The word "for" causes a lot of debate here.
My immediate question, and the question critics of this view would raise, is this. Does this word "for" mean they bought the kingdom with the food they gave?
It is a fair question.
Right. What is the function of bringing up the food and water if it didn't buy their ticket in?
The sources address that specific tension by analyzing the Greek conjunction gar, which translates to our English word "for."
And what do they conclude about gar?
In this specific syntax, the authors argue that gar functions evidentially, not causatively.
Evidentially.
Right.
Okay.
It provides the visible proof of their previously blessed state, not the purchasing price of that state.
Let's use an analogy here to make sure this is crystal clear for you listening. Think of a professional poker player's tell.
Oh, like a nervous habit.
Yeah. A player wiping their brow or tapping their finger nervously doesn't cause them to hold a bad hand of cards. The bad hand is a hidden underlying reality.
Right.
The sweat on the brow is simply the visible evidence of that unseen reality.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The works mentioned by the king, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the prisoner, are the visible fruit of an invisible supernatural regeneration.
He is the evidence.
Yes. The authors cite another section of the Westminster Confession, chapter 11, to cement this idea. It declares that faith alone justifies the sinner, but justifying faith is never alone in the person justified.
It always produces something.
Always.
Right.
It inevitably works itself out through love. A dead tree might carry a wooden sign that says apple tree, but it cannot produce an actual apple.
The living tree produces the apple as evidence of the biological life already flowing inside it.
Yes, and the sources use this grammatical structure to actively argue against Arminian theological concepts.
Wait, hold on. You just threw out Arminian, and I know the notes mention prevenient grace. Let's assume I am not familiar with those debates.
Okay, let's back up a bit.
What is the actual theological collision happening here? What are these authors pushing back against?
The collision is over the fundamental cause of human salvation. Arminian theology generally teaches the concept of prevenient grace.
And what is that?
It is a grace given to all humanity that restores free will, allowing an individual to either choose or reject God. In some historic Arminian views, God's election is based on his foreknowledge.
Meaning he looks into the future.
Basically, he looks down the corridor of time, sees who will choose him or who will do good works, and elects them based on that foreseen action.
So the human action is the deciding factor in that view.
Precisely. But our sources argue that this specific passage in Matthew completely destroys that notion.
Because of the divine passive.
Yes, the perfect passive participle and the evidential nature of their works mean the blessing comes first, entirely independent of human action. And the evidence follows as a guaranteed result.
The sequence is impenetrable.
Sovereign divine decree from eternity past, followed by the inevitable fruit of the Spirit in real time.
But, if their salvation was already locked in, and the sheep didn't do these works to earn the kingdom, what was actually going through their minds when they handed over the bread or visited the prison?
That is a great question, and the text answers this by showing us their reaction to the king's praise.
And it is a reaction of genuine shock.
It really is. Verses 37 through 39 reveal a deeply puzzled response. "Lord, When did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink?
They are completely baffled.
Yes. The authors highlight this intense astonishment to prove a vital point about the nature of true righteousness. Their motives were not mercenary.
They were not keeping a mental ledger of their good deeds, expecting a massive payout at the end of the age.
Not at all. They had absolutely no idea they were accumulating claims upon the kingdom of heaven. Their mercy was sincere enough to be entirely forgetful of itself.
That is a striking way to put it, forgetful mercy.
Yes. The sources note that the unregenerate human nature desperately wants witnesses. It wants applause, it craves control, and it demands meticulous bookkeeping of every moral victory.
Look what I did, give me my reward.
Right. But divine grace teaches the human hand to open without sounding a trumpet in the town square.
So what does this all mean? It suggests that regenerated love operates on almost a biological level rather than a legalistic one.
Going back to the tree analogy.
Yeah, think about that living branch on the apple tree again. A healthy branch doesn't strain, groan, and mentally calculate how to manufacture an apple just to avoid being cut off by the gardener.
It just grows.
It produces an apple naturally because the life-giving sap of the tree flows directly through it. It is just acting according to its newly given nature.
And that natural, unforced outflow is contrasted sharply in the sources with the typical attitude of religious hypocrisy.
Oh, they definitely draw a contrast there.
The hypocrite approaches God demanding a printed receipt. Their attitude is seen over in Matthew 7. Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?
They are intensely, obsessively aware of their own supposed merit.
But the righteous in this passage, acting out of a completely renewed nature, simply saw a human need and met it.
They saw a hungry person and offered their own bread.
Right. They completely forgot the deed 5 minutes later because it was an act of reflexive love, not a calculated transaction to buy off a deity.
They did not imagine themselves clothing royal majesty when they handed over a coat. I mean, they just saw a cold, needy saint.
And Christ points out that he sees what his people so easily forget. He remembers the cup of cold water, the quiet meal shared in secret, the dangerous prison visit.
The righteous are astonished because the king placed immense eternal value on obedience they considered incredibly small and ordinary.
That is the beauty of it.
So, we know the sheep acted out of genuine reflexive love, but who exactly were they helping? The answer to this specific question is the most heavily debated part of the entire text.
Oh, without a doubt.
And this is where the sources draw a very firm, controversial line in the sand.
Yes, the exegetical precision of these documents focuses heavily on the word translated as brethren in English. The king says, "Inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." The authors contrast 3 different Greek words to explain what Jesus actually meant in this context.
Let's look closely at those 3 distinct words because this changes everything about how you apply the passage.
First, there is the Greek word plesion, which means a general neighbor.
Like the guy living next door.
Right, or anyone you encounter. Jesus deliberately used this specific word in the parable of the Good Samaritan to describe general humanity, anyone who happens to be in your proximity.
Okay, that is word number 1.
Second, there is the word pokchos, which refers broadly to the financially poor or the destitute.
Just general poverty in the world.
Right. But Jesus did not use either of those broad words here. He specifically chose the word adelphos, meaning brother.
So why does that specific linguistic choice change the trajectory of the entire passage?
Well, the sources explain that in both ancient Near Eastern usage and wider Greco-Roman literature, adelphos overwhelmingly denotes a literal blood relative from the same womb.
A biological brother.
Yes, or a specific member of an exclusive, tight-knit fraternity. But to understand Jesus, we have to look at how Matthew uses the word within his own gospel narrative.
Let Scripture interpret Scripture, basically.
Yes, precisely. In Matthew 12:50, Jesus explicitly defines his adelphos. He says, "For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother."
Okay.
And later, in Matthew 28, he tells the women at the empty tomb to go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee. It always refers to the inner circle of disciples.
He defines his family around covenantal obedience to the Father, not just biological humanity.
That is right. The authors argue that in the immediate historical context of the Great Tribulation, the least of these, my brethren, refers specifically to the Jewish remnant, the 144,000 witnesses, and the persecuted tribulation saints.
The ones who are traveling the globe, bringing the gospel of the kingdom under extreme duress. You know, it is fascinating how aggressively the notes we are looking at push back against modern cultural interpretations of this text. I mean, they are looking directly at contemporary religious movements and arguing that something critical is being lost or deliberately altered.
They do not pull any punches. The documents specifically call out theological shifts like the social gospel, alongside modern frameworks involving social equity.
We should note for you listening that we're just relaying what the sources say here. We aren't endorsing a particular political side.
Right, maintaining a neutral reporting stance here. The authors argue that these ideologies attempt to replace the necessity of the blood atonement of Christ with secular political activism.
That is a heavy claim.
They assert that liberal theology insists that Delphon means the globally impoverished or marginalized in general, regardless of their relation to Christ.
And what do the sources call that view?
They label this an exegetical fallacy of the highest order.
Wow. They summarize their stance by arguing that feeding the secular poor, while a good civic duty, does not earn salvation or define the parameters of this judgment.
It is a separate issue entirely, in their view.
Instead, they argue this specific passage is a targeted test of how the Gentile nations treat the persecuted, hunted emissaries of the king during a time of unprecedented global apostasy. It is a metric of allegiance.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of New Testament theology, the authors tie this dynamic directly to the doctrine of union with Christ.
Which is a beautiful doctrine.
It is. They reference a defining moment in Acts 9:4. Saul of Tarsus is on the Damascus Road, traveling with official warrants to arrest and execute Christians.
Right.
A blinding light flashes from heaven, knocking into the ground, and the ascended Jesus speaks directly to him.
And Jesus asks, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He doesn't say, why are you persecuting my followers or my church?
That is the pivotal mystical connection right there. To strike the church is to strike the apple of God's eye.
Because they are one.
Yes. The king's spiritual union with his people is so absolute, so intimately bound together, that any kindness shown to them is literally reckoned as kindness to him.
And any blow struck against them is felt by the King of Kings himself.
The sources argue this doctrine powerfully protects the weak and dignifies the most obscure, forgotten believer on earth.
So if this passage is primarily about the treatment of persecuted believers, what does that look like practically for someone listening today?
Well, the sources paint a grim historical picture of what compassion actually cost in the ancient world. Visiting a prisoner or welcoming a traveling stranger was not a convenient tax write-off or a weekend community service project.
It was exceptionally dangerous.
Incredibly dangerous.
We have to remember that prisons in the first century, like the Tullianum in Rome, were not state-funded correctional facilities with cafeterias and medical staff.
No, not at all.
They were dark, subterranean holding cells. If you were in prison, the state did not feed you. You relied entirely on people outside the prison to bring you daily food and clothing.
And identifying publicly with a state prisoner could carry severe social and legal ramifications.
I mean, bringing food to a persecuted disciple meant walking past Roman guards who noted your face.
They're watching everyone who comes in.
Right. It meant risking your own association with a despised illegal movement. It could cost a person their social capital, their economic freedom, or even their life.
These mercies were not abstract virtues debated in a classroom. They were concrete acts of incredibly costly allegiance.
And the sources bring this ancient reality into the present day with some very sobering modern data.
They do. They cite the Open Doors 2024 World Watch List. According to this international data, over 365 million Christians currently face high levels of persecution and discrimination for their faith right now.
That is a staggering, almost incomprehensible number, 365 million.
It is heartbreaking. The text specifically mentioned geographical hotspots like sub-Saharan Africa, noting areas like Nigeria and the Sahel.
What is happening there?
The sources state that thousands of believers are violently martyred annually by Islamic extremists. They point out that in closed, authoritarian nations, pastors routinely rot in undisclosed prisons.
Just for preaching the gospel.
Yes. And the authors ask a piercing question in light of this data. Will comfortable Western believers risk their wealth, their reputation, and their comfort to stand with them, to fund their sustenance, to advocate for them on a global stage?
That brings up a very grounded question for the average listener, though. I mean, in a modern Western context where a person isn't necessarily dodging armed guards to visit a subterranean prison, how do these authors want the local church to apply this text on a Tuesday afternoon?
To answer that practical question, the sources refer back to the Westminster Confession, specifically WCF 89X.6.
Okay, what does that section deal with?
It discusses the third use of the law.
So they are viewing this strictly through the lens of the third use of the law, meaning this isn't a manual about how to get saved. It's the architectural blueprint for how a justified person walks in grateful obedience.
That is precisely the argument. It shows those who are already justified how to please the God who saved them.
Okay.
The authors argue that applying this passage requires the local church to prioritize the household of faith above all other philanthropic endeavors.
Which means looking very closely at the actual people sitting right in front of you in the pews.
Yes, it means aggressively caring for widows within the congregation.
Structurally remembering disabled members who cannot contribute financially.
Right, fully supporting international missionaries and advocating for the physically endangered global church.
It challenges individual families to practice embodied, inconvenient obedience.
Like opening their physical homes, stretching their monthly budgets, and really just clearing their calendars to assist believers in actual need.
The sources argue that if a person claims to be mystically united to Christ but remains utterly cold and inactive toward Christ's needy people, that person should tremble at the prospect of final judgment.
It is a severe warning.
That brings us to the evaluation of these deeds. The audit is complete, the evidence has been presented, and it leads to a stark, irreversible conclusion.
A very heavy conclusion.
The authors want the listener to feel the massive weight of this final decree. Verse 46 reads, "And these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life."
And here's where it gets really interesting in the Greek.
Oh, the sources dive into the specific Greek word used in that verse to describe both of those destinies, right?
The word is aionion.
Ionian.
Right. The authors point out a terrifying, inescapable symmetry in the grammar here. The exact same Greek word, aionion, which means eternal or everlasting, modifies both the punishment of the wicked and the life of the righteous in the very same sentence.
They use this single word to systematically dismantle other popular theological viewpoints,
They strictly refute concepts like annihilationism.
which is the idea that the souls of the wicked are simply extinguished and cease to exist after death. Right.
Yes. Or purgatory, which is the idea of a temporary, painful purification process before entering heaven. The grammar does not allow for either, according to these sources.
It's like a mathematical equation where the variable x applies to both sides of the equal sign.
That is a great way to look at it.
If x represents duration and you define x as temporary on the left side, it has to be temporary on the right side. You cannot change the value of the variable just because you are uncomfortable with the result on one side of the equation.
You have to be consistent.
Right. If the Greek word aionion defines the life of the righteous as infinite and unending, the grammar dictates it must also define the punishment of the wicked as infinite and unending. It is a mathematical, linguistic lock.
The logical log is precisely what the authors are highlighting. The king making this decree is no longer acting as a wandering Galilean teacher.
The tone is totally different.
The sources highlight the massive Christological culmination happening in this moment. The humble carpenter, who once had nowhere to lay his head, unveils himself fully as the eschatological sovereign,
He is the Pantocrator.
the almighty ruler of all things. He possesses the absolute, unquestionable divine prerogative to divide all of humanity and assign irreversible, eternal destinies.
They also tie this final act back to the very beginning of the biblical narrative,
Yes, tracing it all the way back to the foundational Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12.3.
where God tells Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you."
The authors argue that Christ, operating as the ultimate true seed of Abraham, is executing that ancient covenantal promise on a massive global scale.
So he blesses the nations who showed tangible mercy to his brethren and curses those who neglected or attacked them.
The finality of this separation is absolute. The judgment is completely irreversible.
I mean, think of it like a courtroom door that locks permanently from the inside. There is no appeals process, no higher court to petition once that decree is made.
The separation of the sheep and the goats allows for no appeal. The modern world may measure spiritual success by crowd sizes, social media platforms, or polished vocabulary, but the king's judgment will ruthlessly expose the truth.
Expose whether a verbal confession of Christ actually produced tangible, costly love for Christ's suffering people.
Right.
Well, we have covered a massive amount of theological and historical ground today. To synthesize what these sources are arguing, salvation belongs entirely to the Lord, decided by his sovereign decree before the foundation of the world.
That is the core premise.
True, regenerating faith cannot remain hidden. It naturally makes itself visible through active, costly love, specifically directed toward the brethren.
It has to produce fruit.
And finally, Christ intimately, mystically identifies with his suffering people, counting their earthly treatment as his own.
This raises a vital, highly personal consideration for anyone reflecting on these ancient texts.
It really forces you to look inward.
It does. If the king evaluates genuine faith, not by our public platform, our theological vocabulary, or our visible societal success, but rather by how we treat the least prominent, most inconvenient believer in our local sphere.
Yeah.
Who is the least of these sitting in your own periphery right now whose face you might be failing to see?
That is a question that demands an honest answer. Thanks for joining this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We will see you next time.